welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wajenberg. This time we're going to continue our reading of The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton. Our hero, Gabriel Syme, who is an undercover policeman, has infiltrated the circle of the anarchists of Europe, their head committee being 7 men who go by the names of the days, and Syme is the man who is Thursday. They are meeting at a breakfast club, quite out in the open, discussing their plans of assassination. There was a singular silence. Then the secretary said, "We are wandering, however, from the point. The only question is how Wednesday is to strike the blow. I take it we should all agree with the original notion of a bomb. As to the actual arrangements, I should suggest that tomorrow morning he should go first of all to—" The speech was broken off short under a vast shadow. President Sunday had risen to his feet, seeming to fill the sky above them. "Before we discuss that," he said in a small, quiet voice, "let us go into a private room. I have something very particular to say." Syme stood up before any of the others. The instant of choice had come at last. The pistol was at his head. On the pavement below he could hear the policemen idly stir and stamp, for the morning, though bright, was cold. A barrel organ in the street suddenly sprang with a jerk into a jovial tune. Syme stood up taut, as if it had been a bugle before the battle. He found himself filled with a supernatural courage that came from nowhere. That jingling music seemed full of the vivacity, the vulgarity, and the irrational valor of the poor, who in all those unclean streets were all clinging to the decencies and the charities of Christendom. His youthful prank of being a policeman had faded from his mind. He did not think of himself as the representative of the corps of gentlemen turned into fancy constables, or of the old eccentric who lived in the dark room. But he did feel himself as the ambassador of all these common and kindly people in the street, who every day marched into battle to the music of the barrel organ. And this high pride in being human had lifted him unaccountably to an infinite height above the monstrous men around him. For an instant at least he looked down upon all their sprawling eccentricities from a starry pinnacle of the commonplace. He felt toward them all that unconscious and elementary superiority that a brave man feels over powerful beasts, or a wise man over powerful errors. He knew that he had neither the intellectual nor the physical strength of President Sunday, but in that moment he minded it no more than the fact that he had not the muscles of a tiger, or a horn on his nose like a rhinoceros. All was swallowed up in an ultimate certainty that the president was wrong and that the barrel organ was right. There clanged in his mind that unanswerable and terrible truism in the song of Roland, "Pays en tort et chrétien en droit," which in the old nasal French has the clang and groan of great iron. This liberation of his spirit from the load of his weakness went with a quite clear decision to embrace death. If the people of the barrel organ could keep their old world obligations, so could he. This very pride in keeping his word was that he was keeping it to miscreants. It was his last triumph over these lunatics to go down into their dark room and die for something that they could not even understand. The barrel organ seemed to give the marching tune with the energy and the mingled noises of a whole orchestra, and he could hear deep and rolling under all the trumpets of the pride of life, the drums of the pride of death. The conspirators were already filing through the open window and into the rooms behind. Syme went last, outwardly calm, but with all his brain and body throbbing with romantic rhythm. The president led them down into an irregular side stair, such as might be used by servants, and into a dim, cold, empty room with a table and benches like an abandoned boardroom. When they were all in, he closed and locked the door. The first to speak was Gogol, the irreconcilable, who seemed bursting with inarticulate grievance. "So," he cried with an obscure excitement, his heavy Polish accent becoming almost impenetrable. "You say you not hiding. You say you show himself. It is all nothings. When you want talk importance, you run yourselves in a dark box." The president seemed to take the foreigner's incoherent satire with entire good humor. "You can't get hold of it, Gogol," he said in a fatherly way. "When once they have heard us talking nonsense on that balcony, they will not care where we go afterward. If we had come here first, we should have had the whole staff at the keyhole. You don't seem to know anything about mankind." "I die for them," cried the Pole in thick excitement, "and I slay their oppressors. I care not for these games of concealment. I would smite the tyrant in the open square." I see," said the President, nodding kindly as he seated himself at the top of a long table. "You die for mankind first, and then you get up and smite their oppressors. So that's all right. And now may I ask you to control your beautiful sentiments and sit down with the other gentlemen at this table. For the first time this morning, something intelligent is going to be said." Syme, with the perturbed promptitude he had shown since the original summons, sat down first. Gogol sat down last, grumbling in his brown beard about compromise. No one except Syme seemed to have any notion of the blow that was about to fall. As for him, he had merely the feeling of a man mounting the scaffold with the intention, at any rate, of making a good speech. "Comrades," said the President, suddenly rising, "we have spun out this farce long enough. I have called you down here to tell you something so simple and shocking that even the waiters upstairs, long inured to our levities, might hear some new seriousness in my voice. Comrades, we were discussing plans and naming places. I propose, before saying anything else, that those plans and places should not be voted by this meeting, but should be left wholly in the control of some one reliable member. I suggest Comrade Saturday, Dr. Bull." They all stared at him. Then they all stared at their seats, for the next words, though not loud, they all stared at him. Then they all started in their seats, for the next words, though not loud, had a living and sensational emphasis. Sunday struck the table. "Not one word more about the plans and places must be said at this meeting. Not one tiny detail more about what we mean to do must be mentioned in this company." Sunday had spent his life in astonishing his followers, but it seemed as if he had never really astonished them until now. They all moved feverishly in their seats except Syme. He sat stiff in his, with his hand in his pocket and on the handle of his loaded revolver. When the attack on him came, he would sell his life dear. He would find out at least if the President was mortal. Sunday went on smoothly. "You will probably misunderstand that there is only one possible motive for forbidding free speech at this festival of freedom. Strangers overhearing us matter nothing. They assume we are joking. But what would matter even unto death is this, that there should be one actually among us who is not of us, who knows our grave purpose, but does not share it, who—" The secretary screamed out suddenly like a woman. "It can't be!" he cried, leaping. "There can't—" The President flapped his large, flat hand on the table like the fin of some huge fish. "Yes," he said slowly, "there is a spy in this room. There is a traitor at this table. I will waste no more words. His name is—" Syme half rose from his seat, his finger firm on the trigger. "His name is Gogol," said the President. "He is that hairy humbug over there who pretends to be a Pole." Gogol sprang to his feet, a pistol in each hand. With the same flash, 3 men sprang at his throat. Even the professor made an effort to rise. But Syme saw little of the scene, for he was blinded with a beneficent darkness. He had sunk down into his seat shuddering, in a palsy of passionate relief. Chapter 7. The Unaccountable Contact of Professor de Worms. "Sit down," said Sunday in a voice that he used once or twice in his life, a voice that made men drop drawn swords. The 3 who had risen fell away from Gogol, and that equivocal person himself resumed his seat. "Well, my man," said the President briskly, addressing him as one addresses a total stranger, "will you oblige me by putting your hand in your upper waistcoat pocket and showing me what you have there?" The alleged Pole was a little pale under his tangle of dark hair, but he put 2 fingers into the pocket with apparent coolness and pulled out a blue strip of card. When Syme saw it lying on the table, he woke up again to the world outside him, for although the card lay at the other extreme end of the table and he could read nothing of the inscription on it, it bore a startling resemblance to the blue card in his own pocket, the card which had been given to him when he joined the anti-anarchist constabulary. "Pathetic Slav," said the President, "tragic child of Poland, are you prepared in the presence of that card to deny that you are in this company Shall we say de trop? Righto, said the late Gogol. It made everyone jump to hear a clear, commercial, and somewhat cockney voice coming out of that forest of foreign hair. It was irrational, as if a Chinaman had suddenly spoken with a Scottish accent. I gather that you fully understand your position, said Sunday. You bet, answered the Pole. I see it's a fair cop. All I have to say is, I don't believe any Pole could have imitated my accent like I did his. I concede the point, said Sunday. I believe your own accent to be inimitable, though I shall practice it in my bath. Do you mind leaving your beard with your card? Not a bit, answered Gogol, and with one finger he ripped off the whole of his shaggy head covering, emerging with thin red hair and a pale, pert face. It was hot, he added. I will do you the justice to say, said Sunday, not without a sort of brutal admiration, that you seem to have kept pretty cool under it. Now listen to me. I like you. The consequence is that it would annoy me for just about 2.5 minutes if I heard that you had died in torments. Well, if you ever tell the police or any human soul about us, I shall have that 2.5 minutes of discomfort. On your discomfort I will not dwell. Good day. Mind the step. The red-haired detective, who had masqueraded as Gogol, rose to his feet without a word, and walked out of the room with an air of perfect nonchalance. Yet the astonished Syme was able to realize that this ease was suddenly assumed, for there was a slight stumble outside the door which showed that the departing detective had not minded the step. Time is flying, said the President in his gayest manner after glancing at his watch, which, like everything about him, seemed bigger than it ought to be. I must get off at once. I have to take the chair at a humanitarian meeting. The secretary turned to him with working eyebrows. Would it not be better, he said a little sharply, to discuss further details of our project now that the spy has left us? No, I think not, said the President with a yawn like an unobtrusive earthquake. Leave it as it is. Let Saturday settle it. I must be off. Breakfast here next Sunday. But the late loud scenes had whipped up the almost naked nerves of the secretary. He was one of those men who are conscientious even in crime. I must protest that the thing is irregular. It is the fundamental rule of our society that all plans shall be debated in full council. Of course, I fully appreciate your forethought when in the actual presence of a traitor. Secretary, said the President seriously, if you'd take your head home and boil it for a turnip, it might be useful. I can't say, but it might. The secretary reared back in a kind of equine anger. I really fail to understand, he began in high offense. That's it, said the President, nodding a great many times. That's where you fail, all right. You fail to understand. Why, you dancing donkey, he roared, rising. You didn't want to be overheard by a spy, did you? How do you know you aren't overheard now? And with these words, he shouldered his way out of the room, shaking with incomprehensible scorn. 4 of the men left behind gaped after him without any apparent glimmering of his meaning. Syme alone had even a glimmering, and such as it was, it froze him to the bone. If the last words of the President meant anything, they meant that he had not, after all, passed unsuspected. They meant that while Sunday could not denounce him like Gogol, he still could not trust him like the others. The other 4 got to their feet, grumbling more or less, and betook themselves elsewhere to find lunch, for it was already well past midday. The professor went last, very slowly and painfully. Syme sat long after the rest had gone, revolving his strange position. He had escaped a thunderbolt, but he was still under a cloud. At last he rose and made his way out of the hotel into Leicester Square. The bright, cold day had grown increasingly colder, and when he came out into the street he was surprised by a few flakes of snow. While he still carried the sword stick and the rest of Gregory's portable luggage, he had thrown the cloak down and left it somewhere, perhaps on the steam tug, perhaps on the balcony. Hoping, therefore, that the snow shower might be slight, he stepped back out of the street for a moment and stood up under the doorway of a small and greasy hairdresser's shop, the front window of which was empty, except for a sickly wax lady in evening dress. Snow, however, began to thicken and fall fast, and Syme, having found one glance at the wax lady quite sufficient to depress his spirits, stared out now into the white and empty street. He was considerably astonished to see standing quite still outside the shop and staring into the window a man. His top hat was loaded with snow like the hat of Father Christmas. The white drift was rising round his boots and ankles, but it seemed as if nothing could tear him away from the contemplation of that colorless wax doll in dirty evening dress. That any human being should stand in such weather looking into such a shop was a matter of sufficient wonder to Syme, but his idle wonder turned suddenly into a personal shock, for he realized that the man standing there was the paralytic old Professor de Worms. It scarcely seemed the place for a person of his years and infirmities. Syme was ready to believe anything about the perversions of this dehumanized brotherhood, but even he could not believe that the professor had fallen in love with that particular wax lady. He could only suppose that the man's malady, whatever it was, involved some momentary fits of rigidity or trance. He was not inclined, however, to feel in this case any very compassionate concern. On the contrary, he rather congratulated himself that the professor's stroke and his elaborate and limping walk would make it easy to escape from him and leave him behind for miles. For Syme thirsted first and last to get clear of the whole poisonous atmosphere, if only for an hour. Then he could collect his thoughts, formulate his policy, and decide finally whether he should or should not keep faith with Gregory. He strolled away through the dancing snow, turned up 2 or 3 streets, down 2 or 3 others, and entered a small Soho restaurant for lunch. He partook reflectively of 4 small and quaint courses, drank half a bottle of red wine, and ended up over black coffee and a black cigar, still thinking. He had taken his seat in the upper room of the restaurant, which was full of the chink of knives and the chatter of foreigners. He remembered that in old days he had imagined that all these harmless and kindly aliens were anarchists. He shuddered, remembering the real thing. But even the shudder had the delightful shame of escape. The wine, the common food, the familiar place, the faces of natural and talkative men made him almost feel as if the Council of the 7 Days had been a bad dream, and although he knew it was nevertheless an objective reality, it was at least a distant one. Tall houses and populous streets lay between him and his last sight of the shameful 7. He was free in free London, and drinking wine among the free. With a somewhat easier action, he took his hat and stick and strolled down the stair into the shop below. When he entered that lower room, he stood stricken and rooted to the spot. At a small table, close up to the blank window and the white street of snow, sat the old anarchist professor over a glass of milk, with his lifted, livid face and pendant eyelids. For an instant, Syme stood as rigid as the stick he leant upon. Then, with the gestures of blind hurry, he brushed past the professor, dashing open the door and slamming it behind him, and stood outside in the snow. "Can that old corpse be following me?" he asked himself, biting his yellow mustache. "I stopped too long in that room, so that even such leaden feet as those could catch me up. One comfort is, with a little brisk walking, I can put a man like that as far away as Timbuktu. Or am I too fanciful? Was he really following me? Surely Sunday would not be such a fool as to send a lame man." He set off at a smart pace, twisting and whirling his stick in the direction of Covent Garden. As he crossed the Great Market, the snow increased, growing blinding and bewildering as the afternoon began to darken. Snowflakes tormented him like a swarm of silver bees. Getting into his eyes and beard, they added their unremitting futility to his already irritated nerves, and by the time that he had come at a swinging pace into the beginning of Fleet Street, he lost patience and, finding a Sunday tea shop, turned into it to take shelter. He ordered another cup of black coffee as an excuse. Scarcely had he done so when Professor de Worms hobbled heavily into the shop, sat down with difficulty, and ordered a glass of milk. Syme's walking stick had fallen from his hand with a great clang which confessed the concealed steel. But the professor did not look round. Syme, who was commonly a cool character, was literally gaping as a rustic gapes at a conjuring trick. He had seen no cab following. He had heard no wheels outside the shop. To all mortal appearances, the man had come on foot. But the old man could only walk like a snail, and Syme had walked like the wind. He had started up and snatched his stick, half crazy with a contradiction in mere arithmetic, and swung out of the swinging doors, leaving his coffee untasted. An omnibus going to the bank rattled by with unusual rapidity. He had a violent run of 100 yards to reach it, but he managed to spring, swaying upon the splashboard, and pausing for an instant to pant, he climbed on to the top. When he had been seated for about half a minute, he heard behind him a sort of heavy and asthmatic breathing. Turning sharply, he saw, rising gradually higher and higher up, a top hat soiled and dripping with snow, and under the shadow of its brim the short-sighted face and shaky shoulders of Professor de Worms. He let himself into a seat with characteristic care, and wrapped himself up to the chin in the mackintosh rug. Every movement of the old man's tottering figure and vague hands, every uncertain gesture and panic-stricken pause, seemed to put it beyond question that he was helpless, that he was in the last imbecility of the body. He moved by inches. He let himself down with little gasps of caution. And yet, unless the philosophical entities called time and space had no vestige even of a practical existence, it appeared quite unquestionable that he had run after the omnibus. Syme sprang erect upon the rocking car, and after staring wildly at the wintry sky that grew gloomier every moment, he ran down the steps. He had repressed an elemental impulse to leap over the side. Too bewildered to look back or to reason, he rushed into one of the little courts at the side of Fleet Street as a rabbit rushes into a hole. He had a vague idea, if this incomprehensible old jack-in-the-box was really pursuing him, that in that labyrinth of little streets he could soon throw him off the scent. He dived in and out of those crooked lanes, which were more like cracks than thoroughfares, and by the time that he had completed about 20 alternate angles and described an unthinkable polygon, he paused to listen for any sound of pursuit. There was none. There could not in any case have been much, for the little streets were thick with the soundless snow. Somewhere behind Red Lion Court, however, he noticed a place where some energetic citizen had cleaned away the snow for a space of about 20 yards, leaving the wet, glistening cobblestones. He thought little of this as he passed it, only plunging into yet another arm of the maze. But when a few hundred yards further on he stood still again to listen, his heart stood still also, for he heard from that space of rugged stones the clinking crutch and laboring feet of the infernal cripple. The sky above was loaded with the clouds of snow, leaving London in a darkness and oppression premature for that hour of the evening. On each side of Syme the walls of the alley were blind and featureless. There was no little window, nor any kind of eye. He felt a new impulse to break out of this hive of houses, and to get once more into the open and lamplit street. Yet he rambled and dodged for a long time before he struck the main thoroughfare. When he did so, he struck it much farther up than he had fancied. He came out into what seemed the vast and void of Ludgate Circus, and saw St. Paul's Cathedral sitting in the sky. At first he was startled to find these great roads so empty, as if a pestilence had swept through the city. Then he told himself that some degree of emptiness was natural, first because the snowstorm was even dangerously deep, and second because it was Sunday. And at the very word Sunday he bit his lip. The word was henceforth for him like some indecent pun. Under the white fog of snow high up in the heaven, the whole atmosphere of the city was turned to a very queer kind of green twilight, as of men under the sea. The sealed and sullen sunset behind the dark dome of St. Paul's had in it smoky and sinister colors of sickly green, dead red, or decaying bronze, that were just bright enough to emphasize the solid whiteness of the snow. But right up against those dreary colors rose the black bulk of the cathedral, and upon the top of the cathedral was a random splash and great stain of snow still clinging as to an alpine peak. It had fallen accidentally, but just so fallen as to half drape the dome from its very topmost point, and to pick out in perfect silver the great orb and the cross. When Syme saw it, he suddenly straightened himself, and made with his sword cane an involuntary salute. He knew that that evil figure, his shadow, was creeping quickly or slowly behind him, and he did not care. It seemed a symbol of human faith and valor that while the skies were darkening, that high place of earth was bright. The devils might have captured heaven, but they had not yet captured the cross. He had a new impulse to tear out the secret of this dancing, jumping, and pursuing paralytic, and at the entrance of the court as it opened upon the circus, he turned, stick in hand, to face his pursuer. Professor de Worms came slowly round the corner of an irregular alley behind him, his unnatural form outlined against a lonely gas lamp, irresistibly recalling that very imaginative figure in the nursery rhyme, the crooked man who went a crooked mile. And we will continue the encounter with Professor de Worms next time.